Welcome everybody to this Bright Blue event which we're holding in partnership with Citizens Advice on the very topical subject of universal credit, on which I'm sure that you'll have lots to say, and I'm anticipating a very interesting discussion here. So, as many of you know, Bright Blue is an independent pressure group and think tank for liberal conservatism. Please feel free to tweet about this event as we go along. Bright Blue's handle is at Bright Blue, and then obviously please tag in Citizens Advice as well. So I'm Diane Banks, I'm a non-executive director of Bright Blue. I'm chairing the panel today, and I'm joined by Nigel Mills, who is the MP for Amber Valley at the far left here. Great place, I grew up there. Dame Clare Moriarty, Chief Executive of Citizens Advice. She was previously Permanent Secretary for the Department for Exiting the European Union, and she also chaired the COVID-19 Impact Inquiry for the Health Foundation, I think that's right. So far right, we've got Deven Ghelani, and Deven is a founder of a fantastic business, which I'm going to get him to just say a bit about in a minute. He's founder and CEO of Policy in Practice. And then to my immediate right, we've got Peter Aldous, who is MP for Waveney, and he's an officer of the Universal Credit APPG. And then finally, to my immediate left, we've got Andy Brown. Andy is Chief Officer at Manchester Citizens Advice. All right, so today, the format is going to be that each of the speakers speaks for 5 minutes, and there's going to be time for questions from the floor and, of course, from the audience that are joining us online today. If you do have a question, please, can I ask that you wait for the roving mic to arrive, because otherwise the people online won't be able to hear you. If you want to ask a question online, there's a Slido link. If you click that, then the questions will be texted to me, and I can read them out. So we're asking the panel to address a number of key themes. Above all, we'd like to talk about, of course, the impact of the removal of the £20 universal credit uplift. And we are also very keen to explore the long-term future of social security more generally after COVID. I think there's a lot of discussion we can have there just looking forwards. So we're going to be talking about the pandemic. We're going to be talking about whether universal credit has been a success, how universal credit can support a fair recovery. We're going to be talking about work coaches. Do current rules provide enough flexibility to provide personalised support for recipients? How can we create a simple and robust system to fit with real lives rather than a one-size-fits-all solution? And finally, we are going to be addressing what further changes need to be made to better support particular groups, such as those with children or those with long-term health issues. Right, so I'm going to start with Nigel. So Nigel, if you could start by giving us your 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure to be here. I think if we'd been sat here at Party Conference 2 years ago debating universal credit, I'd have been sat here saying, great idea, rolling out reasonably now, a bit concerned how we scale it up. Is there the resource to get people in on a kind of like scale? Can the platform cope with a large volume of claimants? I think what the pandemic taught us, if anything, was actually it can. The sheer number of new claimants that got onto UC and just about got paid the right amount on, well, we hope the right amount, at the right time without falling over, I think shows that UC can cope with the volume of claimants that it needs to cope with. And I think there probably is now a pressure on the government, or at least there should be, to move on with the managed migration. I think actually for a lot of people they will be better off with a managed migration with the protections that comes with it than they will be having a kind of long drawn out haphazard natural migration if they happen to move house or some other situation changes. So I think that would be something, if I was in the government's shoes, I'd be now thinking, having spent years slowing this down and thinking, can we make it work? We now know we can make it work, and the old systems are now so clunky and out of date, and people are getting so unfamiliar with them. I think actually we're better off now getting onto one benefit system. And actually, we can now stop talking about systems and technology and software, and we can talk about whether we like what it's being asked to do, rather than when it can actually do it. I think is a better place for the debate, which I think moves you on then to your next question of, can we put back in or add in the original design of a more personalised support for individual claimants to help get them ready for work and into work. I suppose the first challenge on that is, what are we dealing with? Are we dealing with a post-pandemic difficult job situation with lots of people unemployed, and we're going to have to find ways to find them work with a high volume of claimants per support person? Or is the job market going to be so strong that everyone who's fit for work can easily find a job in the next few months, and we go back to where we were pre-pandemic of actually most people who are out of work being people who need some support to get back into work? I suspect we won't know the answer to that until we've worked through the end of furlough, worked through the winter, see if any more restrictions turn up, and see how many businesses actually aren't going to survive once they have to pay their full wage bill. But I think in the medium term, we need to get back to that universal support offering, which was part of the design but has never been probably part of the system. It's not at the scale that it's there. And I think normally when as a select committee we go and visit a job centre, we get told what wonderful individualised support packages and advice and training can be given, and then you never quite really see that on the ground. It's kind of like supposed to be there, but I don't know whether it's for pressure of work or lack of budget or something that the individual claimant doesn't always experience, that whole situation. So I think that is something that, now it's fully rolled out everywhere and everyone's familiar with the system, we should be seeing more of that personalisation. And there are now jobs for people if the training is there. If you can get yourself an HGV licence, you can earn quite a lot of money. But it's always been very patchy. My seat's on the border of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and we had a bizarre situation a few years ago. If you lived 1 mile one side, you got your HGV licence paid for by the job centre. If you lived on the Derbyshire side, they wouldn't pay for it because it was a different area and they didn't see a need. And that was a couple of grand for a good job that you couldn't get, and therefore you couldn't have the job. So there's things like that we need to make sure we've got sensible design. You asked about the £20 uplift. I've always thought we needed to have that at least till the end of the pandemic. I think there's a very strong case that the 10 years of welfare restraint took benefits too low. And I keep saying to the government, if you can put some evidence out which shows the benefits are the right level without the uplift, then I'll happily support you. But they're not very keen to do that piece of work. I'm kind of sense the reason they're not very keen is they don't like the answer that's going to come, so they just don't want to publish it. But I think that is a sort of fundamental question. If you're trying to design a system that's supposed to encourage people into work and convince them they'd be better off, they need to feel that they're better off, not feel life is a complete struggle that's demotivating and makes it very hard for them to then go and look for work. And I think as a country, we do want people on benefits to have the sort of standard of living that we think that we all expect to have in that situation. And we need benefits to be generous enough for you to be able to heat your house and have other things that we all take for granted. So I think the government should be very careful, actually, that without that £20, these glib lines of we'll just work another couple of hours just don't work for a lot of people on UC who either can't work or are far from work or already working the maximum hours on low pay they can, that isn't an option for them in that situation. And frankly, if it is an option and they can go and work more hours and get higher pay, you'll claw it back anyway because it's a tapering benefit. Yeah. If people go back into work, you'll soon recover that. I think 3 hours in work for somebody who's getting their UC tapering would take that £20 and pay it back anyway. So I think the government are being a little bit foolish, I think, politically, and they're being unfair on people by taking that away. I sense by the end of October the government may have realised that probably wasn't having spent months wanting the government to stand up and not back down on every time something got difficult. I think they've picked the wrong issue to start with. But no doubt we will see in a few weeks with the rising cost of living how bad a decision that is. But I think that's my 5 minutes, so I'll leave the rest for questions.
I know. A lot of commentators have been saying that this one-off emergency fund is just them admitting that actually they should keep the £20.
Yeah, I think if you've got 500 million to spend on that fund and another, I kind of think that the benefit you're targeting at people who are out of work or working on the lowest pay is a better way of spending money actually than creating very complicated funds that people have to apply for in different ways all around the country. I'm not sure that's an ideal way to run a welfare system.
Yeah. Thank you, Nigel. Right, moving on to Clare now.
Thank you. So, Citizens Advice, as you may well know, we're a national charity, and we deliver free, confidential and independent advice to people. Many people come to us for advice on benefits. In the last year, we helped 400,000 people with issues relating to universal credit. So we feel we have a really good insight into what's going on there. And I think, as Nigel said, I think we should very much recognise that universal credit surprised its critics during the pandemic. People did question whether it would be able to step up to the numbers that were involved, and actually it did that very well and got cash quickly to people who were in financial difficulty. Along with the coronavirus job retention scheme, furlough, it really did make a huge difference to people. So the universal credit with the £20 uplift softened the blow for people who found themselves out of the job market or with reduced hours, and furlough made it possible for people to stay in work. So I think it is worth recognising that the benefit itself and the many thousands of people within the Department for Work and Pensions.
Can I just interrupt you, Claire? I've just been messaged to ask to turn that microphone around.
Yep, sorry, is that better? So, as I say, the benefit itself and the many thousands of people in Department of Work and Pensions who administered it really did make a difference to the position that we were in during the pandemic. But we've got to think about the challenge going forward. We know that there's been a huge amount of change in the labour market. Seismic changes have taken place, and we're now in a position where both furlough and the £20 uplift are coming to an end just at the point when we have we're seeing energy bills soaring. We're seeing people worried about energy firms failing, and the cost of living crisis really does risk casting a shadow over our recovery. Our research shows that 35% of people are worried that they're going to struggle to pay their energy bills in the coming winter. And as we know, everything is significantly worse for people who are on universal credit. So we've done some calculations of the amount that people will see their bills increase by, income reduce by as a result of supplier failure. That could be £30 a month. But for people who are on universal credit, losing the £20, seeing inflation rise, potentially losing warm home discount if their supplier fails, some people could be seeing a squeeze of £35 to £40 a week as a result of the cost of living crisis combined with the end of the universal credit uplift. So we really do need to think about how universal credit can continue to fulfil its purpose of supporting people and helping them into work. So what do we think should be done? We do think that the government needs to invest to address the cost of living crisis. As others have said, the Household Support Fund, £500 million can only be welcome, but we really don't think that it's sufficient, and it feels in the wrong place. It's a hyper downstream measure to resolve an issue. We don't really want as a country to be putting more into emergency aid measures. We need to be thinking about how we create an environment where people do have the money that they need to live on. We know that as we come with the ending of the £20 uplift, 2.3 million people are going to be unable to make ends meet. 40% of people receiving universal credit are in work, and 2/3 of them worry that they're going to experience hardship. So the simplest and best way of investing is actually to extend the £20 universal credit uplift. And Andy will say more shortly about the frontline experience of Citizens Advice supporting people who are facing into this big crisis. But I just wanted to come on to address this issue about flexibility, about whether the benefit itself is able to do what it needs to do. And we think that there need to be changes to make sure that it is actually fit for people's real lives. The central idea, as Nigel said, is certainly good. I remember as a permanent secretary seeing the squiggly graphs of what happened to people pre-universal credit. If you got a small amount of work or your income moved around a bit, there were just masses and masses of cliff edges. People were dealing with a complex mix of different types of benefits, and income could go all over the place. So that central idea of taking 6 benefits, putting it into one, and really focusing on how it could provide flexible, smooth support support to people was a good one. But in creating something that's simple, I think we see that there's the risk is that we've created something that is also too rigid, and rigid to the point where it undermines the objectives that were set for universal credit. So just to take a couple of examples, one around childcare. So it's a very good feature of universal credit that it does refund people up to 85% of the cost of childcare. The problem is that it does it a month in arrears. So you've got to be able to pay in advance for childcare and then wait for a month in order to get that money back. And our research shows that 1 in 6 families with children under 16, that's over 310,000 families overall, find that actually they either are prevented from getting into work or having to work fewer hours because of something which is actually not a fundamental, it's not an intentional design, but it's just the way the rules play out. Likewise, the way that the payment periods work, I'm not going to get too technical about this, but if you are in non-traditional insecure work, an agency worker in hospitality, for example, being paid fortnightly with variable shifts, you can find that a benefit which was intended to provide that stability of income is actually producing a compounding effect where income can be fluctuating wildly, and that makes it very, very difficult for people to manage their finances, and it makes it much less likely that they have the mental bandwidth and the capacity to make that step, to take the risk of going back into work, which is, again, all of what universal credit was about. We think these are problems that are capable of solution, but they would require, there is a kind of complexity about making them, and they would require government to face up to making some changes to something which has been very much defined by its clarity and simplicity. But our argument would be, we need universal credit to be fit for the future. We need it to support all the people. 5.9 million people currently on universal credit. There are 3 million people still to transfer from legacy systems. If we want it to work as a benefit to support people and particularly to help them get back into work, we're going to have to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And I do think there's a great fundamental point there that universal credit, the pandemic is great proof of concept. The fundamental idea is it can work. It just needs a bit more flexibility, and I'm sure we will come on to that and talk a lot more about that. So I'm going to move to Deven now. Could you start by telling us, you run an incredibly innovative and exciting organisation. Could you start by telling us just a little bit about what it is?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I set up policy and practice. I worked on universal credit as a policy idea at the Centre for Social Justice after being on benefits myself, and left that world because I saw a big gap in how policy's developed and how it's communicated to people. So I'd go to places like this or anywhere and tell people what universal credit was and how it's going to make a difference, simplify the system, be better off in work, and eyes would just glaze over and roll. So I figured the best way to try and explain it to people was I built a calculator. It's now one of the benefit calculators on gov.uk, but you go through it, you see how much support you get out of work if you're in work, the impact that has on you, and again, just much clearer and more simple than I think the tools that were there in the past. You didn't need to be an expert in the benefit system to be able to use it. So that's how we started, and we've moved on to doing data analytics for local authorities using that same engine and approach. But to go back to the policy, shall I pick up on the? On the? I will reference some of the work we do in this, but I was thinking about how to address effectively a Conservative base, because we are at the Conservative Party conference, and say a bit about actually what are the messages to take about universal credit, and what would I be calling for within the party just to make it even stronger than it already is. I think universal credit is now seen as a success, a very clear success, and especially when you've had something that's been really battered by the media from 2013 onwards, often with real good justification, to see it come through and it be just fundamentally so much better than the system it replaced. There's no way the legacy system could have coped with something like the pandemic. Absolutely not. People just wouldn't have gotten paid. Certainly not as much as they should have done. And so it's so much better than legacy. I think the other thing the pandemic's shown is that you can make changes to it relatively rapidly. The £20 uplift came in almost overnight. Unfortunately, it's going away almost overnight as well, so there are downsides to it as well. That's kind of down to the party. But it does show the flexibility of the system itself. So I think universal credit itself is very strong. I think the 3 points I wanted to sort of really pull in is what you're calling for from the party, from government, is really clarity of what you want social security to be for. Simplicity. Remember, universal credit was meant to simplify the system. I'll say a bit in a second about the extent to which it's done that or not. And effectiveness. So actually making social security more effective is the only answer you've got if you're not going to make it more generous. And being able to show you can do that. So to touch on each one of those briefly. Clarity, what is social security for? You know, Conservative or coalition governments have frozen or held back benefits with no real clarity to the purpose behind it. We've broken the link between, for example, housing costs and housing support, or had done until it was reintroduced. What's the rationale there? You know, all of a sudden 22.7% of housing costs makes sense? It doesn't. You've got so many people now facing that shortfall. You've got things like the benefit cap and the 2-child limit. Do we need both of them? Do they make sense? Do they just interact in a really weird way? They do interact in a really weird way, so you don't need both. You've got things like the under-occupation charge, which was introduced to try and get people to move on and stop under-occupying properties, but actually if that was going to work, it would have worked by now. The ones who are stuck there paying it are still stuck there paying it. So you've got this kind of lack of clarity over what you want social security to be for, and actually bringing that back in, deciding which one of the, rationalising those cuts or being clear about what you want social security to be for is I suppose the first point. The second point is simplicity. So universal credit has simplified the system, but as someone who works in it and feels very strongly in that, it's still too complicated by far, particularly at the local level. And I'm not blaming local government or anything for this. It really stems from national policies. But you've got council tax support you're also supposed to apply for outside. Now you've got discretionary housing payments if you've got that shortfall between your rent and your housing support. You've got this £500 million additional support to plug gaps for people that need to know it's there for it to be able to plug those gaps. Social tariffs with utility companies. You've got pension credit, other things that really just sit outside the system. And a bit of analysis we did, if you apply for something like discretionary housing payments, you quite likely get it. 8 in 10, 9 in 10 of those that apply are awarded it. Of those most in need, and we've done this work for lots of local authorities, how many people do you think actually apply or even know about it? Of those who are in arrears with a shortfall between their rent and housing. Anyone want to hazard a guess? If you, do you want to? It's like 12, 15, maybe, if you're very lucky, 20% to kind of get that level of take-up. 1 in 5 maybe know about it. So having this complexity really doesn't help. Again, that's some of what we do. So we help local authorities identify who those households are, carry out targeted communications to them. One example with pension credit, identifying 400 households eligible for pension credit, 188 of those go on to take it up. That brings in almost £500,000 to the local economy that people should be claiming anyway, and you can just kind of do that work. And the final point is effectiveness. So I suppose that highlights you can make the system more effective. We're doing some work right now with councils on council tax reduction. Why do people have to apply for council tax support? All of the information you need to apply is in the universal credit claim, pretty much. Now what you need is councils willing to make decisions that simplify their own local council tax support scheme, so you don't need more information to be able to do that. But kind of making it more effective. You've got the data there to say, what does a £20 uplift do? Does it incentivize people into work, or does it just create holes in the system that you have to plug with these other gaps in support? You can answer those questions. The data's there in universal credit to be able to do that. And I suppose one other bit of lobbying we've been doing at Policy and Practice is to encourage DWP to share more of that universal credit with data with local authorities, for those local authorities to be able to do much more with it. Right now they share just those that apply for council tax support, which is about half, 2/3 of those on universal credit. So there's much more you can do there. Another bit of work I'll just reference, linking universal credit data with information on children's outcomes. Those that are known to be at risk. Do they end up in care? Do they move off the at-risk register? If they've had a £20 cut to universal credit or a £20 increase, and you can actually do that work. It's not huge. You've got the data there to do it. It's questions you can answer. And finally, I suppose again, to end on a high note for those of you that are here representing the Conservative base, I think with universal credit you've got an opportunity to really show that you can make it work for everyone, and that somehow you had a handle on this all along. But you need to make some pretty sharp changes over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think the theme that's emerging is that it's broadly a good thing, but it definitely needs a lot of refining. Peter?
Yeah, many thanks. And Universal Creditors, in my local job centre, they were volunteer to be a pilot at a very early stage of the rollout. So it has been in my inbox as an item for a long time. And initially, there were real challenges. And I think actually you would say that it was an enormous IT project. Government don't do these very well. Actually, I know people in the private sector of the same scale would have really struggled with this. So it had major challenges. Actually, when it came to the hour it was needed, because it had actually, I think that hard work, that hard grind, did mean that it was up to the task to get out money very, very quickly. And I think you would say it was one of the success stories of COVID. And as I said, the government were quite right to have actually rolled it out quickly. By the same, in reverse, I think they are actually wrong to be taking it away now. We've just had one of the most gigantic shocks to the world economy in the last 100 years. And I think the idea that, we just switch on the light and we reverse to go back to normal is not going to happen. COVID is going to have a very long tail, and we have seen that in the past 10 days with the crisis in the energy sector. There are challenges with regard to food. I think housing rents, a lot of people on Universal Credit have no alternative but to be in the private rented sector. I think that will be a challenge. The rising cost of childcare is a brake for people to actually get out to work. And in a constituency like mine, actually getting to work where we've not got a very good public transport system is a challenge. So there are all manner of these costs actually cascading in on people. I think there was an element, as was just been said, benefits, Universal Credit, the uplift had been frozen for 4 years, so there was an element of catch up. And I think I fear that it's been the wrong policy decision to remove it now. I think there is talk that people say, well, there are an enormous number of jobs out there. That is correct, but there are a great many, probably half people claiming Universal Credit are actually in jobs already at the moment. I think you would also say that a number of those who are not in a position now to go and take up some of those jobs where there are vacancies. I would also say it's probably not consistent with the levelling up agenda. The levelling up agenda has a lot of focus, quite rightly, on infrastructure, but actually equipping and providing people with the skills to take up those jobs, and as Conservatives provide a fair and benefit system, a safety net, if you like, which provides you with some degree of security so that you can then move forward and take up those opportunities and benefit yourselves, improve your lives. I think we have made a mistake. One advantage, I think, one thing this government do, they may be accused of U-turns, but they also, do move very quickly. And the introduction of the household support grant would indicate that. It was a concern of mine that actually the chickens were coming home to roost much, much more quickly than I feared they were going to be. I think, no sensible person actually now says we must get rid of Universal Credit. I think technically it is still Labour Party policy, and I don't think they've actually confirmed that it isn't. But the system is here, and we now need to make it work. I think it would have been better to have kept the uplift, because that is the best way of providing support to the poorest in society. If we look, there are a host of other issues that we need to be addressing, which we've heard about, to get the system working properly. And that will take time, and it will cost money. And I think we'd have done better starting with the base of the £20 in place. You know, there's the taper rate which needs to be looked at. You need to look at increasing the work allowance, increasing the childcare element, the challenges of childcare. We've heard about that, and there is still a lot of very vulnerable people still on legacy benefits, still scared of making that quantum leap. They need to be assisted and supported to sort of making that change and getting on UC. And I think actually levelling up, building back better, one of the things, probably the best legacy we could have made, was to have completed this task, which has taken a very long time. And actually, I think with benefit of hindsight, if we do it properly, we can say, well, you know, that was something that this, first of all, a coalition government and a Conservative-led government Conservative government have got right.
Right, absolutely. Do you think the government might do a U-turn on the uplift?
The answer, I suspect, probably no, but I suspect when you get to a certain time, a few months, 18 months forward or whatever, when you top up the additional support that has been made,
yeah.
it might not cut, you know, it may actually come pretty close to that £6 billion, and you might have actually said, well, actually, wouldn't it have been best to have done it, kept it in the first place?
Yeah, and saved all that administrative work, yeah. Thank you, Peter. Right, on to Andy.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to try and frame this discussion now into a local context. I've worked for Citizens Advice for 33 years now. I've worked in various capacities as a volunteer advisor, a caseworker for people with disabilities, and for the last 25 years as Chief Officer in local Citizens Advice, at the moment here in Manchester. In headlines, Manchester's experience of COVID was that unemployment levels reached 14% across Greater Manchester, higher than in the 1980s and also higher than following the recession of 2008. A third of the private sector workforce was furloughed. We even had some of our staff on furlough who were in legal aid contracts. The number of UC claimants rose from 174,000 in April 2020 to 325,000 in May 21. The government took welcome steps to protect people's homes, jobs, and put much needed money into people's pockets through the Universal Credit Uplift. Despite this, though, many of our clients experienced real hardship, telling us, we're now both unemployed and the landlord threatened eviction if we cannot pay the rent. We have no money for food and the next UC payment is not due for 2 weeks. I've not paid for my gas or electricity for the last 2 months. My rent is due this week. I've been using my credit card to pay my rent and now have debts of over £1,000. I can't pay my bills and support my family. We saw in Manchester a significant increase in the number of people seeking help with universal credit, about 54%. Housing, 18%, and employment inquiries, 84%. Through the pandemic, our client profile changed. Fewer older people, fewer Asian people, and fewer people with disabilities contacted us compared to 2019. The loss of face-to-face access to our services was undoubtedly a barrier for some people to get help. COVID-19 therefore presented us with some real challenges. How do we reach vulnerable, digitally excluded groups who are less able to access advice through digital channels? And how could we meet the predicted increase in volume in demand following the removal of furlough, which was originally going to be October of last year? We responded by expanding our digital and telephone services with video technology now located in over 50 community venues, such as food banks and homeless day centres, enabling people also to access our advisors via video appointments through our website. We lifted and shifted 140 staff to work from home. We extended our opening hours to include evenings and weekends, and we established a new service to support people at risk of fuel poverty. Now, as the government's protective measures are removed, we're bracing ourselves for yet more unprecedented demand for help with universal credit, employment advice, debt inquiries, housing inquiries. And this, coinciding with a £20 a week cut to universal credit, increasing fuel costs as the energy price gap rises, our fear is that some people will simply have to choose between feeding their families or heating their homes. Certainly, universal credit has been an improvement, as we've heard, over the previous legacy system, and we would suggest the government could do a number of things, quite simple things, to ensure that UC can be effective in the post-pandemic landscape. Firstly, retain the £20 uplift. Not everybody, as we've heard, will be able to return to work as normal once the government support ends. The loss of furlough and the reduced amount of UC will see many people pushed into a financial cliff edge or even plunged into more debt. As in Jasmine's case, this will make it more difficult to stay in work. Our client Jasmine has 2 children and is working, but the loss of the £20 uplift will remove her from eligibility for universal credit, and therefore she will lose her passported entitlement to having 80% of her childcare costs met. She was barely getting by, and the cuts will make life even harder for her and her family. Having the principal responsibility for childcare, the cut is likely to disproportionately affect working women who are single parents, for some making work unaffordable. Secondly, increased flexibility. No 2 households are the same, and people often have many different factors affecting how or when they need to receive support. To be effective, universal credit needs to recognise this individuality. Our client Lucy was a victim of domestic abuse and had been struggling financially since breaking free from her partner and looking after her daughter. She is worried that universal credit cuts will push her into debt when she's been working really hard to move on from her abusive past and find paid employment. In general, for people going through a relationship breakdown, the one household claim rigidity of universal credit adds a layer of complexity to an already difficult situation, making it much tougher for claimants. And thirdly, tailor the universal credit rules around real life circumstances. The more complex needs a person has, the more flexible universal credit needs to be effective. In many ways, the current system is not designed to do this. Our client Soraya lives with post-traumatic stress disorder. She has a bedroom tax shortfall, and the universal credit cut is causing her unimaginable stress and worry and deteriorating mental health. She's absolutely no idea how she will cope, as she was only just managing to scrape by previously. And take David's case. He was involved in a life-changing accident. He claimed universal credit during the pandemic and uses most of it to cover his care costs. He'd been hoping to move into more independent accommodation again soon, but he's now worried that with a £20 cut, which actually is £80 a month, he won't be able to afford this. What is clear from the stories that our clients tell us is that universal credit needs to play a vital role in protecting them and keeping their heads above water when they lose their job, if they are sick, or if their circumstances change. And we believe that with some changes to universal credit, it has the potential to do this.
Thank you, Andy. Again, lots around flexibility, individuality, absolutely crucial. Thought you also made a really good point about digital exclusion. That's not something that's come up, because obviously over the pandemic we all assume that everybody's got access to the information they need. Okay, thank you. Right, we're going to move to some questions now. So if you have a question, please could you say your name and which organisation you are here with? Just again to reiterate, could you please wait for the roving mic to come around? Right, who would like to go first? At the back there.
You talked a lot about data and analytics and working with local authorities. Do local authorities have the capacity and the capability to make the best use of the data that we have available to improve outcomes? Can we be resourcing local authorities more in that way? Okay,
let's start with Deven.
Sort of no and yes would be my short. I mean, they do. I think locally administered support has the potential to be incredibly effective. What I've seen, I've grown policy and practice throughout 2013. So throughout austerity, we've grown to serving 39 councils from me with a phone and a laptop at the start. So we are able to grow and make a difference, and there is that capacity there. Candidly, I've never been so concerned about how stretched local authorities are, not because there's entirely. It's that you need to invest in change or in doing things differently. And when you're trying to bring in really a new way of doing things, so contacting people proactively to prevent problems before they happen, that's not what local authorities are geared up to do. All of their resources are going in one direction. To try and pull them away from another, you need a little bit of spare capacity to show that's possible. Some councils are able to make that happen. Others, frankly, are struggling a lot. So, others will be familiar with that. But it's a challenging time for councils without a shadow of a doubt. And yes, being better resourced would be great. The government needs to see them as being a supportive partner in this. And it would make things like the household support grant much more effective. So if you can use that as a preventative support tool instead of something purely reactive and dealing with a crisis after it's happened, that £500 million can show welfare spend can be made more effective if you use it more intelligently.
The councils that are struggling, is it because they don't have the systems, or is it that they're not organising themselves properly?
No, I think the systems, I suppose that's what we help with. Not every council can sort of build this from scratch themselves. Yeah. So that's where organisations, ours and others, can help, and citizen advice too. Like they've got their own sort of tools and support networks. What they need is just the capacity to adapt and employ those things. And some councils do have that capacity, but not very many.
Yeah, and to organise it in the right way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Peter.
Yes, I think it is a postcode lottery. Now, from my perspective, in my area, the local authority is Suffolk Council, which is actually with a merger, one of the largest district councils in the country. They were they led on universal support when universal credit first came in, and that was a major success story. They took it as part of their work to make it work and support people, and they created a partnership with Job Centre Plus, with Citizens Advice. And when they lost the contract for leading on universal support and it went to Citizens Advice, I think I did have a concern at that time. Why get rid of something that was working very well? Now, actually, as we've subsequently, it's continued to work well, because in East Suffolk, there is good partnership working with Citizens Advice, and while Citizens Advice have got heading up on the contract, they're continuing to work with the council and with local charities as well. So that's certainly my experience.
Yeah. And Clare and Andy, how does it look from your point of view?
I think our sense is very much that local authorities are under a huge amount of pressure. Quite early on, when I arrived at Citizens Advice, I sat in on a call with a client who had a whole range of interconnected problems, and I think one of the things that constantly comes up is that people don't have, on the whole, one single problem. So many of the people who come to us are trying to navigate lots of different things at once, and part of this client's problem was to do with council tax support. And they have reached a situation where the local council had closed its physical doors as a result of the pandemic, but actually it effectively closed its phone lines as well. So it had reached the point where as a member of the public needing to get in touch with the local authority for help with a council tax issue, you couldn't go and see them, you couldn't ring them. If you sent them an email came back saying, don't email us, we'll email you. They didn't email. People were then being penalised for not having got in touch. So I think there's a real issue more broadly about the capacity of local government, which has been under such pressure for such a long time. And we see that coming through in all sorts of ways because local government supports our core services, which are what enable Andy and all his colleagues to meet that range of needs. So I think there is definitely an issue with local government.
Interesting. Anything to add, Andy?
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Claire said. In Manchester, we have a really positive working relationship with the City Council, and we share our data sets with theirs. But I think the point I would like to make is there are many organisations out there who have really good data sets with rich information about what's happening to people on the ground. Energy suppliers, the health service, Citizens Advice, the council. And if we can bring those data sets together, we would have a really powerful mechanism to target things like the Hardship Help Fund, like Universal Credit, like getting vulnerable people on priority service registers. So I think we're missing a trick by not bringing those data sets together.
Yeah, I mean, so much of this, like anything that these days, comes down to data and how available it is and what we do with it. Nigel, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'm almost tempted to disagree with everybody on this.
Oh, excellent.
I'm not quite sure what we're trying to achieve at times with this. I mean, I've got a two-tier council area, so you've got a district council with no money that's quite small and a county council that's very stretched on social care and is huge. And we've just introduced UC and taken the Housing Benefit Administration largely off the council to move it into UC. And then we now want to sort of like ask councils to become a kind of like a secondary welfare provider with no expertise, no knowledge, no resource, in a kind of patchy sort of way without the data. And councils clearly know who the people they're helping through social services with problem children and those issues. We've stopped them running schools by academising them all, so they don't have the school link to find out through parents what the problems are. So I think you want to make your welfare system work and get money to people who need it through welfare, and not try and have top-up funds for councils who don't really know who they're trying to get to and can't have the data, haven't got the resource, and it's only a 1-year fund or a 6-year fund, so they can't even invest in the resource to have it anyway. Now, I think there's clearly a role for regional mayors and larger councils in skills delivery and in designing local support, which we could try and devolve out of DWP. And if you do that, you may then have the data and the knowledge and the skills in that organisation to make that work. But we've got a very patchy level of devolution. So I would be slightly cautious that we're creating a problem by not wanting to have something as part of a national system. We think we can find a way of offsetting the worst of it by having some local discretionary funds, and then we just pass the buck out to local government and say, go and do something with this money. And then they all do slightly different things in slightly confusing ways, and it's quite slow because they've no idea what to do when you first give them the money. And then you take it off them again. I think it's a sort of like slightly crazy thing that we're trying to do, and we probably ought to have one welfare system rather than about 300.
Yeah, it's kind of an element of passing the buck, I suppose. I mean, it sounds like more direction needs to be given on what to do with the information.
Yeah, if you want local welfare, let's scrap DWP and move welfare down to be done by upper tier councils. But I think that would be a completely crazy thing to do. Yeah. I mean, it would be incredibly expensive. So
if I can
why do half of it here?
Sorry, I just want to come in. Just two quick points. Not entirely in response. I think one is, what's stopping local authorities from doing this as well as they could. And East Suffolk's a good example. We've been working with them for some time, and somehow it's gotten caught up in governance limbo. And now all of a sudden the council, for some reason, are just absolutely scared that HMRC will tell them they can't do this. So they've stopped doing it, which is really interesting and ridiculous. And Peter and I will chat about that later. The other side of it, though, is you're talking about districts at upper tier and lower tier. Some of the best work, I always thought, because data analytics done at scale, you can do it across big unitaries. Some of the best work is done by district teams with 2 advisors who know how to use it well. That's the gap. And you're talking about capacity. Actually, if you can just use it well, you can go out and reach out to really quite large numbers of people with very limited manpower. It's about having the right skills and capability in place to be able to do it well. But yeah, it's pretty, agree in the context that it's pretty patchy. So getting local authorities to all adopt a sharper approach is difficult, but again, they are very stretched.
Yeah. Okay, there was another question. Yes, here. You could say who you are and where you're from.
My name's Rachel. I'm from Christians Against Poverty. A few of you touched on maybe now's the time to get on with the managed migration, which is really interesting because I think we're in the position currently where the DWP are prioritising a voluntary approach with Move to UC now, and perhaps not being super upfront about the risks of losing out on some of that transitional protection, and saying that they don't have the data to identify who will be worse off when they move across. So you might have a view on that, Deven. But just interested, a question really, is now the right time, thinking about the support people will need to move across, the services that they might need to rely on to help them do that? Is now the right moment for that? And while perhaps the systems is working quite well, and you're right, there's been a lot of success, there are some issues that haven't been solved. Still lots of concerns about the initial period when someone first applies and sort of hardship there, and challenges around debt deductions. What are some of the other things we need to get right perhaps before we move that last 3 million across?
Absolutely. Is now the right time, Clare?
So thank you. I think it's a really, really good question. And I mean, as Nigel was saying, we've now got to a point where the legacy benefits are, in a sense, it's a bit like a software system. When they cease to be maintained in the same way, having this kind of complicated patchwork with many people now on universal credit, now twice as many people on universal credit as on legacy benefits. It feels like it is the logical next thing to do, but I think the absolutely critical thing, as you said, is how it's done. So it is really, really important that people aren't moving over on a voluntary basis unless they are going to benefit from that system. So what needs to be wrapped around people to make sure that if people are moving on a voluntary basis ahead of any transitional protections, they're doing it with proper understanding, and people aren't going through what is effectively a valve unless that is the right thing for them to do. So I think there's an interesting question about what support is needed for individuals to help make that decision. And again, as you say, I think some of these, the kind of issues about the way the rules work, which I was highlighting, they are things which we would say absolutely have to be cracked. I mean, they need to be cracked for the people who are already on universal credit, but if we are approaching the point of 3 million more people transferring it in, it's not going to work. I think the initial weight is clearly something that is problematic. It's also, to the best of my understanding, I'm not an expert on universal credit, it's baked quite hard into the universal credit system. But what are the imaginative ways that the design could be adapted so that some of these issues around childcare, around insecure work, of which we know there's been a big increase over the last 10 years or so. We know there are issues around the conditionality that's put around people. We know there are issues with work allowances. We've done some research that's highlighted all of those issues. I think if those issues were addressed, we would feel more confident about that move over.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Did you want to come in on that?
Yes, I think Rachel has highlighted there are a whole host of items still to do in the to-do list with universal credit, and one of them is the transition, the managed migration for those remaining on legacy benefits, who are some of the poorest and people in the disabled, and some of them in real challenging circumstances. I think if we wait for the ideal time to do it, we may be waiting a very long time. And I think looking back rather holistically, you may actually say that introducing universal credit itself at a time of overall macroeconomic policy of deficit reduction was not the right time to be doing it. But if we'd waited for the right time, in politics, the right time never arises. So I think that we should be doing it in a responsible and and understanding way, providing people with the right advice to be able to do it, because there is real fear out there. People are worried about making a quantum leap into the unknown and actually being worse off, and we need to support and assist them in doing that so that doesn't happen. And in many respects now, I can hand over to Deven to tell us how we do it.
Go for it, Deven.
Thanks. That actually isn't a bad segue. Ever the optimist, I think there is a case to be made for accelerating managed migration if you do it in the right way. There are some challenges with it, of course, as many in the room will be aware, but I think that one pitch I made to DWP a little while ago, before the pandemic, but when managed migration was an actual thing, you use it to make universal credit work, look good. You've got the data there to be able to figure out, you actually, as you move across, you're eligible for council tax support, we're putting you onto that. You're eligible for this social tariff, we're putting you onto that. You're getting this transitional protection. Make universal credit feel rewarding instead of what it felt like at the time, which was a punishment. They fixed things quite a lot around the 5-week wait. You've got run-ons for those on legacy benefits, so they will get that carry on from, if they're on housing benefit or job seekers allowance, they'll get an extra 2 weeks of support. You can get an advanced loan. There's a way in which you can kind of make universal credit feel potentially quite strong and solid. There was another point you raised, which I think is really important, though, around debt and the way in which DWP takes money off people. DWP is just so much better at it than HMRC.
Right.
And that's almost the problem. It's so effective at, and it's got the legislative power to be able to take it away from people at source. These overpayments exist. Universal credit was there to kind of eliminate them. I think the problem here is, one, legacy tax credit debts from years and years ago with no real ability from HMRC to prove they actually exist. These are kind of customer claim error. They frankly deserve to be written off. If you've been administering yourself that badly, you should just write everything off at least 3 years old or more. The problem is there are still significant overpayments in current year as well, never mind anything else that a lot of people on tax credits will face, but it's much harder to argue against clawing those back, and DWP will do that well. A lot of that information is in universal credit, so having worked with the data, you can see deductions. So we produce a financial resilience score on each household for the councils we work with. So you can see which ones have sanctions, deductions, third-party deductions, any other kind of... So you can actually build this really rich picture of which households are struggling more than others, and therefore which households you might want to target that COVID, the household support grant to, or other things, which is again why I think some of the approach to this can be quite preventative. So I think there are ways in which you can make it work. Whether or not that will happen, and therefore whether I think we should go ahead with it, the two need to go together.
Yeah, but it's possible. That's good to know. Nigel, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this does really matter that we get this right. And the reason why it matters to a lot of people is, perhaps we should explain this. If we move you from your legacy benefits onto UC and you were receiving more than you will get on UC, you get to keep that excess until inflation erodes it away. If you have a change in circumstance and move what's called natural migration, you go straight onto the new UC levels with no protection. And that change in circumstance can be moving house because your landlord evicts you, or you change job, or you split up with your partner, or you have a new partner, and you just immediately move. So there are a lot of people who, if we move them, will get some protection. If we let it drift on for a few years, they're gradually coming through into the system and get less money. So it's not as good for them. Which is why I think actually, now we know the system works, moving people is probably the right thing for them to do. The Select Committee did a report on this, and actually, if we are giving people nearly all of their household income through the existing benefit system, and we're moving them by our choice onto a new one, there's no reason why they have to have a 5-week wait. We can just stop paying them their benefits 1 month and pay them the new one the next month without a gap, and we could just manage them through without that issue. That we could fix. Now, if you look at the different cohorts we've got, some of the people we need to move are on tax credits who have to make an annual claim every July. Not that hard to say, right, next year you're making a UC claim, not a tax credit one. they're used to making a claim. It's a slightly different form. They probably wouldn't even know they were claiming something different. They just think we changed the name or something. Now the amount is a bit different, so they might notice. But equally, they don't get the wrong amount and have to pay some back at the end of the year, and it get horribly complicated. So now there are, I think, 700,000 people who are the furthest from work on the most disabled in many situations. Those, I think, we would have to be more careful with how we move. But I think actually, rather than this being oh God, can we do this? Will the system stand up? Do we know what we're doing? Which is where I think we were with the migration 18 months ago. I think we could now actually change the mindset and say, actually, look, we just can't maintain all these systems. We've got a couple of guys who are near retirement who know how this software works to make these thousands of payments every week. If one of those retires or gets ill or something, we really are down actually to how on earth do we know how to make this system work? I mean, it's not quite Kit Kat wrapper in the fuse box of your old car time, but we are... these things haven't been invested in now for a decade because we thought we were stopping using these legacy benefits in 2014. We're kind of like limping on 7 years later with 30-year-old mainframe software to administer some of these. There is quite a risk out there that we arrive at work one day and this thing is broken and we've no idea how to make these payments at the end of the month.
Andy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a very, I think, quite simple point from me. I think managed migration would be far more effective as long as people had the opportunity to get independent advice. And for me, I think the question was about timing, and where people are migrated and UC will give them a better deal, I think they should be migrated. But at this moment in time, where we've heard about the external context and environment of energy prices, taxation, etc., where people are going to be potentially much worse off, where migrating them will make them worse off, there will be a double impact there because of the external environment. So I would leave them at this moment in time on the legacy benefit.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Good point. Okay, any more questions from the room? I've got a few on the line. Yes.
Hi, I'm Joan Abbas from the University of Bergen, and I'm kind of studying these policies and particularly focusing on the politics, so my question relates to that. So when I look on certain parts of Twitter, I can see that there is very strong opposition to reversing the £20 uplift in universal credit, but I wonder to what extent that represents the views of voters more broadly, and in particular Conservative voters. And in that sense, does the government kind of think public opinion is on their side with this move, or is this kind of an issue that isn't necessarily that salient and it's more kind of fiscal responsibility that matters to Conservative voters?
Certainly, from what I understand, that it's not massively popular amongst Conservative voters either, but others will say more. Nigel, do you want to...
Yeah, I mean, we're politicians, not opinion pollers. I keep getting journalists ring me and tell me they've done some opinion polling and surveying, and voters overwhelmingly don't want the £20 taken away, and even Conservative voters slightly less overwhelmingly, but still strongly think it's the wrong thing to do. I think the politics of this, I'm cautious on this because I think we should talk about what's right and what's fair and what's decent rather than what's politically advantageous. I think 11 years ago, we'd come out of an economic downturn. There was a real feeling, certainly amongst my constituents, that actually it was too easy not to work. People were getting quite generous benefits and they could game the system, and it wasn't fair. I'm going out to work 40 hours a week, leaving early in the morning, and my neighbour's getting everything for doing nothing. I think after 10 years of welfare restraint, I don't think that concern is in the same way. We've made structural changes. We've got universal credit, which shows work pays. We've got quite a tough sanctions regime, and we've had better economic times. There hasn't been that level of unemployment out there. I don't think there's the same political concern that welfare's too high and it's too easy. And so I think we should be very careful. We're not playing the politics of a decade ago when there was a problem to fix. Now there actually isn't one, and we actually may end up going so far that we look cruel and harsh and leaving people in an impossible situation which nobody wants to see, and everybody has grandchildren or friends who will end up in this situation. So I think the politics are not where they were a decade ago, and we should be quite cautious on assuming the same tactics work, because I think the economic position is far different.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
Do you want to go first?
I would largely agree with Nigel. It's a question of doing what is right rather than what you think might play to a particular client base. I think he's right. Things have moved on in the last 10 years or so. I do not envy the Chancellor's choices. Only he knows what a difficult challenge he has got to balance the books. We saw that in the period when Parliament was sitting for 3 weeks in September. We had to vote through some tax increases that were not in our manifesto, which people pointed out were breaches of manifesto promises. That this utterly unique whirlwind we've had to deal with in the form of COVID has meant that you've had to break promises to keep promises. So I don't envy him. My sense, just the feedback that I get from constituents, and I represent a coastal town where sort of 25% of households receive universal credit, that it's been the wrong decision. I hope in many ways I'm wrong on that, but I sense it would have been far better to have kept it. I think as far as Conservative voters are concerned, Conservative voters, like all people, if they see an uplift in people in poverty, desperation and destitution, they will demand something is done as well.
Deven.
It's an interesting introduction, doing what's right. I've been trying to do what's right in politics for the last 15 years, and it's made me one of the worst pundits on the planet. So I'm not sure if that holds, and I thought it was an excellent question. I'm going to tell just two very quick kind of vox pop type responses that I've got from talking to people about this. One is from my mum, bearing in mind her son works in social security and kind of knows this stuff pretty much inside out. And one of her responses was, "But it's temporary. It was always meant to be temporary." And it was just kind of really interesting. It stopped me in my tracks, because you sort of think your mum knows about what you do and pays attention, but very, very rarely. But that's kind of an interesting example of more or less the sentiment you're talking about. Will we get away with it? The other one is from a claimant who gets the £20 uplift and is about to lose it. And I had the opportunity to have a conversation with her. I'll call doesn't matter what I call her. And I asked her, what impact is this going to make on you? And obviously it's going to be really tough. Living costs are going up, transport costs more, everything costs more. What would you like? Is there anything else you'd rather the government did with it? Yes. Which again, it's not. There are other things you can do. Her housing situation in the private rented sector is really poor. She showed me a picture after the conversation, and it's not a great place to live. Now the government, through universal credit, just increased the support they're giving to her landlord by £120 a month. He just upped the rent as she moved on to universal credit. He sort of suddenly noticed her again and whacked it up from, by 120 quid. Government has no problem paying landlords that. Could you spend the money better? Yes, you could. That's not the point. What we got is some unity around the social security system is not adequate, and that's what there was kind of one voice behind. Could you spend it better? Lots and lots of ways you could spend it better, unfortunately. Well, 2-child limit, if you're trying to tackle, depends on what you're trying to do. 2-child limit to tackle child poverty, just a whole bunch of holes in the social security system that if you just rationalise, makes people's lives easier.
Yeah.
Alongside that, the real question, the real point being made about the £20 uplift is what level of social security is adequate? And it's not a question the government seems particularly keen to answer, which I think is the point we started on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Any Clare?
I'm not going to comment on Conservative voters. That's not my place. But I think that this point about fiscal responsibility and what needs to be done is really important. And I think it does come back to this question about the adequacy. And I thought Nigel's comment right at the start. If somebody produced the evidence to say this is the universal credit without the £20 uplift is the right level of benefit, then this would feel like a very different debate. But there is a real sense that benefit levels have been eroded to the point where people are really struggling to survive. And I think the real question is whether we can see that the large amount of money that would be required to maintain the £20 uplift as being an investment in the same way that government looks at that other investments. The work I did with the with the Health Foundation's COVID-19 impact inquiry, you can see the trace from the levels of inequality that we have as a country to our levels of resilience, to the experience we had through the pandemic, to widening inequalities, because in every dimension, COVID-19 was worse for people who are already in difficult circumstances, and that will have an impact on our resilience and our ability to survive the next global shock, whatever it may turn out to be. So I think in the levelling up space, we absolutely have to think of levelling up not just as being geographical, and definitely not just as being about concrete pouring. It's got to be about supporting people, a people-led recovery that thinks about social capital. And we could then have a debate about what is the best way of investing in people, and given all the ways that universal credit works and flows money in different places, that would be a really interesting debate to have. But I think trying to change the mindset into saying, how do we invest in people, and we think about this not just as a drag cost on the economy, but as a way of positioning ourselves better as a nation, that would feel a good place to be.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. I don't particularly think this is a political question. It would be very difficult for me to comment on the mindset of Conservative voters, particularly coming from Manchester, where it's pretty solidly Labour. What I can say is we support 50 to 60,000 people, residents of Manchester, every year, and we had a 54% increase in people wanting support around universal credit. I suspect the vast majority of those people would say, please keep the £20 uplift. And from the stories that I've shared with you, I think that would emphasise that.
Thank you. And just moving on from that, I've got a few questions from online here. There's a potentially controversial one, which does actually follow on quite nicely from what we've been talking about. Great question from Mary. As we continue with the economic recovery, is there a danger of the return to a rhetoric about strivers and shirkers? So I guess the question really is, do we feel like the broader narrative has changed over the pandemic? And anyone want to pitch in with that one?
Yeah, words we never actually use, hopefully. Look, I think 11 years ago there was a concern from people that people were gaming the system, getting away with it. Those of us who have had to deal with the welfare system through casework can tell you actually, the sanctions regime was incredibly tough. You've got assessments for disability benefits which are haphazard in their accuracy. It's probably a generous way of putting them. You've got compulsion to go out and work. You've got a job search requirements they can monitor through UC whether you're applying for jobs and going for them. I would say to people, actually, you can be pretty reassured that if you're fit for work and you're not, and you're trying to dodge working, this system is not a straightforward one for you to get through now. Clearly, there are some people who can manage it. And where we were before the pandemic was most people who were claiming welfare were not there because they wanted to be. In fact, I would say the overwhelming majority would much rather have not been there. They were there because they were not ready to work, or we hadn't quite got the support right. And we were trying to get them closer and closer to that. Now, that may well have changed. There may well be people now out of work who are fit for work, and we can get into work with the right support as the economy starts to improve. So I don't think that narrative was a helpful one. I don't think it was accurate in recent years in any way, and I suspect it's not accurate now. And I think, 6 months' time, I think we'll be back in the position that the people who we've got out of work for any lengthy period will be needing support, and will be very, very happy if their life didn't put them in that situation, rather than seeing it as a lifestyle choice.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I think Nigel's largely said it all. There will always be people who are gaming the system, but my sense is that is far, far less than it was a decade ago. The system is much better to preventing that sort of thing. I think actually from the Conservative Party's perspective, elections are won from the middle ground, and that means we do need to remember our roots going back 100 years or so to being a one nation party, to being a caring and compassionate party, and looking and representing all the people. And I think if we don't do that, there is a danger that we may reap a very unpleasant whirlwind.
Yeah, I guess there is a sense that the pandemic has brought people together, so hopefully we'll continue in that way. Yes, let's take a question here.
Thanks. Mark Haslam from Step Change Debt Charity. Thank you, panel, for a really interesting discussion, and couldn't agree more with a lot of the points made on childcare costs. Having to pay those up front is a real problem for single parents. Excuse me, single parents make up 22% of people coming to Step Change for help, 6% of the population. It's a huge issue. I guess my question is probably a little bit about accountability and the crisis. So we've seen a tale of two pandemics with the impact on household finance. A lot of people have been able to save. That's been the majority experience of people in policy-making circles and politicians, I imagine. So the lived experience of people through the pandemic has been very different at the bottom. Some people have fallen into rent arrears. We estimate about 450,000, 500,000 people in rent arrears. A lot of those people protected to some degree through the crisis, but now facing the worry about losing their homes. There's an accountability issue here for government, because if the government basically policies push people into the private rented sector, which is inherently insecure, and if you combine financial difficulties with the PRS, you're going to get a bad outcome in terms of people losing their homes and on a downward spiral. So what protections can the government put in place around universal credit, housing allowance perhaps, rent debt funds perhaps, to support people through this difficult time? You know, government borrowed long on the crisis. Are we able to get a bit more support into the system through universal credit or through other means? And I think kind of the second part of this on accountability is going back to Deven's point about tax credit overpayments. We've just done a report which showed 98% of people coming to Step Change for help with tax credit overpayments, which, as you say, often 6-10 years old, are put into hardship by them. 60% go and borrow as a result, because there's no other way to meet the bills. So particularly when the universal credit is already recognised as like the minimum people have to live on, shouldn't we be doing something, or shouldn't we be holding DWP accountable for tipping people into debt? And maybe there's a kind of, what does the panel think about switching the default in terms of deductions, I think, or making the DWP accountable for pushing people to debt through some kind of better performance management, internal frameworks and so on.
Yeah. Andy, you're seeing all of this on the ground. Go to you first.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, Step Change, like ourselves, will be bracing for what we believe will be unprecedented demand. Not simply new clients that are being made redundant as furlough comes to an end, as they lose their jobs, but also from people who have been hidden during the pandemic, those people who've been protected from the measures that restricted bailiff actions. So we're absolutely anticipating that we will get a raft of employment inquiries, a raft of debt inquiries, a raft of mortgage possessions and rent evictions at a time when the whole world is going digital by default. So it's going to make it incredibly difficult for large proportions of the population to get the advice that they need. And I absolutely agree with you that there is an accountability question there, and the government should be doing more about protecting people in this next phase of recovery from the pandemic.
Peter?
Yes, I was thinking on how I should answer your question, and a very good and complicated question, and I was trying to come up with a complicated answer, and I come up with a simple one, which is keep the £20 up. But you are right. In what we've seen in the last 2 weeks is the energy chicken has come home to roost. I think what we're going to see over the next few weeks and months is a really big housing crisis. You've got an awful lot of people are in the private rented sector, and they are going to struggle to pay their rent. Some landlords may well be attracted to be inclined to get out of the private rented sector because the residential market is still pretty buoyant. It's an opportunity to cash in your chips. So then you have got more pressure on the social sector, and there ain't enough houses there. And then if you look at let's look at some of the housing associations. A lot of them do have plans to build more houses, but if they have got a colossal accumulation of rent arrears, they're going to be in a weaker position to do that when they go to raise funds to do that. And some of them might even go out of existence or have to join and amalgamate with other housing associations. So, I think that this is a real challenge coming down the line.
Nigel?
Yeah, I think we, as Peter says, we should be very cautious about how we unravel what's happened in the pandemic. And my expectation is people have just about kept their head above water because they couldn't spend money, they couldn't be repossessed, and as life starts to go back to normal and things unlock, then all these things will start to unwind. And I think we'll find, sadly, a very large number of people who could just about get by before the pandemic have not been able to get by because they couldn't work, they couldn't top up their income, and they'll have ended up with rent arrears with their landlord, which the landlord will have either happily or angrily had to sit on, and because they couldn't do anything about it, and now things unwind and the landlord has to have a choice. What am I doing with these arrears? Do I kick the tenant out? Do I try and find a payment plan that they can't possibly afford to pay back over any reasonable period? What do I do? I think the government will be well advised just to look very carefully at schemes that can, with the government, the tenant and the landlord, find a way of getting rid of those arrears over a year or so, and if that needs some money from the taxpayer to go in to resolve that situation. Because actually what will happen, if you evict someone, they end up homeless, falling on the council to house them, which costs an absolute fortune. You then got other support services, they'll end up in arrears, they can't get a new tenancy, they'll end up falling out of work. You end up creating a horrible spiral of expenditure for the taxpayer, which I think with a bit of creative thought at this stage you could find a solution where we say, well, the landlord has to write off a third, the tenant has to pay back a third over a period of a decent time, and in return for a 1 year secure tenancy to get through all this over that period, or whatever you would do, the taxpayer will pick up a bit of those arrears. And I think you could find a relatively low-cost solution that may be lower cost than all the consequences that you'll trigger if you don't put something in place. That's the kind of imagination I would be using discretionary housing funds for, actually, to try and, having just criticised giving discretionary funds to councils, but I think in this situation, actually, where you can see people who, through no fault of their own, have got a problem there is no realistic prospect they can fix, then I think we could find some creative solutions if we tried.
Yeah. Deven.
No, I really like that, actually, from Nigel. It's far more constructive than telling landlords to suck it up. So I like that one quite a lot.
I think, in part.
yeah. But a little bit, not quite so much, yeah. I think other longer term challenges, how do you really tackle this? And I remember when I first put universal credit forward as a policy idea, and lots of debates that went into government, and they changed quite a few things about what some aspects of the original vision. So you can't get it if you've got savings above £16,000, so it makes it very difficult to buy a property if you're on universal credit, because as soon as you get above the savings level required for a deposit, you can't buy one. Another one is very hard to get kind of mortgage if you're a homeowner to get any support from universal credit, certainly for your housing costs. I remember saying, the argument against it is we're not paying people to build their capital base. And my response to it is, yes, you are, just not the person living in the property. Right. And that's never really been acknowledged, this idea that actually you are, the benefit system exists. In large part, 40% of universal credit payments go to landlords, as in not directly, unfortunately for them, right, but ultimately, it's housing support. So, that's a huge chunk. The government should have a bigger say, and then ultimately the answer is buy the homes. Another creative option might be to put down the deposit. I've been building this business for 10 years. The best financial decision I've made throughout all of that is buying a house, and that's really depressing when you've worked as hard as I have to try and build a company. So, there are some serious challenges there.
Clare, do you want to add anything?
Just briefly, I think certainly we would say yes, definitely we need to look at ways of dealing with the arrears that are built up, and that is in this world of what are the kind of directly COVID related things and what are the longer term issues. There is a specific COVID issue about the rent arrears that people have built up that is going to need, as others have said, more than just hoping it will go away. And the other thing we're very conscious of is council tax arrears, and the nature of council tax. Is that you can go very quickly from being £100 in arrears to having the entire £2,000 worth land as a debt. So we're going to need these type of creative solutions. I think the other point, just to pick up your point about about debt repayments and whether it's a tax credit or the, as Deven was saying, the DWP's more orderly process. But we know that for some people, the retentions from their universal credit to pay back are actually going to be in this world, assuming that our words fall on deaf ears and the £20 uplift doesn't stay, those are going to be the sorts of things that tip some people over the edge. So maybe that's another area where there just needs to be some creative thinking about what needs to be done right now to help people get through a very difficult winter.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, I know there's a few more questions coming online. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get to them all, but I hope that you've all found it interesting and that you'll be able to have some key takeaways. And on that note, I'd like to just ask the panel, what is the one piece of advice you would give to the government with regards to universal credit? A very, very quick, snappy answer, Deven.
Unleash the power of the data behind it to figure out what works and help local authorities and DWP itself do the right thing for claimants.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
Sorry, on this, have a Damascene conversion at the last moment to keep the
I thought you might say that. Okay, Andy?
Yeah, simply rethink the £20 uplift and retain it.
Obviously, the £20 uplift, and I think be open to this question about how we make universal credit do the thing it's intended to do, and just get into some of those knotty questions.
Mm-hmm. Nigel?
Well, I think we have to agree on the £20. We've all done that. And if a second one, I would be saying now believe in the system and go back to the base idea you originally had for how you could use it to support people to progress into work and through work, and not see it as a kind of salami slicing cost only, which I think is where we got to for the middle phase of it.
Mm-hmm. So, in conclusion, keep the uplift. Okay, so thank you so much to Citizens Advice for sponsoring this panel. Thank you to the panellists and thank you to the audience, all of you, for turning out at such an early hour in the morning. I do have to say that you can join Bright Blue for the special price of £10 during conference only. I think it's only £20 anyway, but that enables you to get invites to many more of our events. We've got 27 events running through conference, so please look out for more of them. Okay, so I'm going to finish off with a round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much.